What if the biggest power move Shedeur Sanders ever made didn't happen on a football field? Not a touchdown, not a game-winning drive, not even a viral moment. It happened in a quiet room across a negotiation table when he asked the question most athletes are never told to ask: who owns the upside? Before the money hit the headlines, before the internet started debating contracts and culture shifts, there was a decision that changed everything. Reports suggest Shedeur was presented with a major brand opportunity, the kind most young athletes would sign immediately. Big number, big visibility, big cosign. But instead of asking how large the check was, he reportedly asked about structure, equity, participation, long-term alignment. And when ownership wasn't part of the conversation, he walked away. That's the moment this story really begins. Because this isn't just about endorsements, it's about leverage. For decades, athletes have been taught to chase exposure first and hope it turns into power later. Smile for the campaign, wear the logo, take the flat fee, move on. The brand keeps the upside, the athlete keeps the check. But Shedeur flipped that formula. Instead of treating leverage as something you earn after years of dominance, he treated it as the starting point. And according to industry buzz, that approach forced brands to rethink how they negotiate, not just with him, but potentially with everyone who comes after him. This wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. There were no public ultimatums, just a quiet refusal to operate under outdated rules. And here, where it gets interesting. Once one athlete proves the blueprint works, the entire system starts to feel fragile. Because if attention is an asset, and assets are supposed to compound, then the real question isn't how much you're paid. It's how much you own. And what happened next didn't just elevate one player. It exposed a crack in an industry that's been running on autopilot for decades. Here, what separates this from a typical athlete endorsement story. Most players are conditioned to see brand offers as validation. A major company calls, the number is big, the spotlight is bright, you sign before the moment disappears. That's the traditional playbook. Exposure first, leverage later. But according to reports circulating in business circles, Shedeur Sanders didn't follow that script. When presented with a significant offer, he allegedly declined because equity wasn't included. Not bonuses, not performance incentives, actual participation in the upside. And that's where people inside the industry started paying attention. Because turning down a large upfront deal isn't emotional, it's strategic. It signals something very specific. I'm not here for short-term visibility. I'm here for structural alignment. That mindset reframes everything. Instead of being a face attached to a campaign, he positioned himself as infrastructure. Instead of asking for a bigger check, he reportedly asked for a bigger stake. If his name drives demand, then his name should live on the balance sheet. If his audience activates, then he should share in the compounding value, not just the first payment. That logic challenges decades of habit. Brands are used to treating athletes like interchangeable megaphones. One signs, one fades, another replaces him. But once an athlete demands ownership logic, the hierarchy shifts. Suddenly, it's not about renting attention. It's about negotiating access to a distribution channel the athlete already controls. And here's the uncomfortable part for legacy systems. If one player secures participation, how do you justify denying it to the next? That single question forces internal conversations most executives would rather avoid. Because once profit sharing enters the room, flat fee models start to look outdated. But this wasn't just a negotiation tactic. It was a line drawn early, and that early timing is what made it disruptive. This wasn't a late career power flex. It happened at a stage when most athletes are told to be grateful and quiet. And that's when the old model started to crack. For decades, the endorsement model has been painfully simple. A brand pays an athlete to wear the product, post the photo, show up at the event, maybe say a line in a commercial. The athlete gets a guaranteed check. The company keeps the upside. Campaign ends. Everyone moves on. It works, it's predictable, and most importantly, it protects the brand's control. But what Shedeur reportedly pushed for wasn't a better endorsement. It was a different category entirely. Instead of flat fees tied to appearances, he leaned into ownership logic. Instead of performance bonuses, he aimed for participation in scaling revenue. Not symbolic alignment, structural alignment. That shift sounds subtle, but it changes everything. Because exposure fades, ownership compounds. When you accept a one-time payment, your upside ends the moment the campaign ends. But when you negotiate royalties, equity, or scalable participation, your upside grows with demand. If your influence drives sales, you benefit from the long-term momentum, not just the announcement. And this is where brands reportedly had to pause. It's one thing to sign talent. It's another thing to concede structure. Once you grant profit participation to one athlete, you create precedent. And precedent spreads fast in rooms filled with agents, executives, and advisors. Suddenly, the conversation shifts from "how much are we paying?" to "why are we keeping all the upside?" That's uncomfortable territory. Because the old model isn't built for shared power. It's built for managed talent. It assumes the institution owns the engine, and the athlete fuels it temporarily. But if the athlete already owns a direct audience, controls attention, and activates demand without traditional gatekeepers, then the leverage math changes. Now brands aren't buying exposure. They're negotiating access. And that's the turning point. Once an athlete is seen as an economic engine instead of just a promotional asset, the entire endorsement framework starts to feel outdated. But the real shock wasn't in the negotiation rooms. It happened when the spotlight hit and the market responded. The real disruption didn't start with a press release. It started when demand hit. When Shedeur aligned with a luxury fashion house like AMIRI, this wasn't positioned as a cameo or a celebrity walkthrough moment. He wasn't slotted in as decoration. He was elevated as a co-headliner. That distinction matters. Appearing in the room is visibility. Shaping the moment is power. And reports suggest the response wasn't gradual. It was immediate. Within hours of the announcement, traffic surged. Interest spiked aggressively. Systems that were designed for celebrity engagement, for controlled hype cycles and managed rollouts, suddenly felt strain. That's the difference between attention and activation. Brands are used to awareness. They plan for likes. They forecast for impressions. They engineer drops to create artificial scarcity. But what unfolded here reportedly wasn't manufactured buzz. It was real demand triggered in real time. And when infrastructure buckles under demand, it exposes something uncomfortable. They planned for visibility. They didn't plan for velocity. Luxury brands spend millions building platforms that can handle global campaigns. So when systems struggle anyway, it signals a deeper miscalculation. The assumption wasn't that people would show up ready to transact instantly. The assumption was that they would browse, scroll, absorb, and maybe convert later. But this audience didn't wait. The switch flipped, and demand followed. No multi-week hype campaign. No legacy media rollout orchestrating momentum. Just alignment, announcement, response. That sequence unsettles institutions because it suggests control has shifted. When an individual commands direct trust at scale, brands can't pace or manage outcomes the way they used to. They can't throttle influence. They can't stagger engagement. They react. And here, why this moment mattered beyond fashion headlines. It proved that the old funnel model, awareness first, conversion later, collapses when the audience is already activated. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was proof of leverage in motion. And once that became visible, the conversation moved from "is this working?" to something far more disruptive. What else does this model apply to? Here, where the story gets deeper. This wasn't a one-deal gamble. It wasn't fashion hype stacked on top of football fame. What Shedeur appears to be building isn't a brand, it's an ecosystem. And ecosystems don't depend on one revenue stream. They reinforce themselves. Start with fashion. That builds prestige. It positions him in rooms that control cultural narrative. It raises perceived value, but prestige alone is fragile if it's isolated. Now add food. On the surface, something like a sauce line feels almost too ordinary, but that's exactly why it works. Food lives inside homes. It's daily. It's routine. It creates intimacy. When your name sits at dinner tables instead of just runways, your presence shifts from aspirational to personal. That grounding matters. Then there's gaming, and gaming isn't just entertainment, it's identity. Younger audiences don't build loyalty through sports talk shows or highlight reels. They build it through interaction, time spent, shared digital space. If you embed yourself there, you're not asking for attention. You're becoming part of how people spend their time. That compounds differently. Now layer in wellness. That move signals longevity. It ties his brand to performance, discipline, and sustainability, not just weekly stats or short-term headlines. It says, this isn't a moment, this is a system. And when you zoom out, you see what's happening. Fashion builds prestige. Food builds intimacy. Gaming builds reach. Wellness builds trust. Each vertical solves a different problem. Each vertical touches a different audience, and each one protects the others. If one sector cools, the ecosystem doesn't collapse. That's not diversification for safety. That's architecture for momentum. Most athletes think in campaigns, one deal at a time, one headline at a time, but this looks like network thinking. Every move becomes a node. Every node feeds the whole. Jersey sales spike. Cultural relevance rises. Cultural relevance rises. Brand equity increases. Brand equity increases. Negotiation leverage strengthens. And here's the key detail most people miss. When you don't rely on a single gatekeeper, not one league narrative, not one brand contract, not one media cycle, you can't be cornered. That's control. But what makes this strategy even more disruptive isn't the ecosystem. It's how quietly it's being executed. Here, what truly unsettles the industry. It's not just the ownership clauses. It's not just the ecosystem. It's not even the system failures under demand. It's the silence. In a sports culture built on reactions, debates, and viral sound bites, silence is rare. And when it shows up consistently, it's intentional. While critics question him, while commentators speculate, while hot takes try to frame confidence as arrogance, he doesn't respond. No emotional clapbacks. No defensive interviews. No late-night subtweets designed to trend. Just results. That restraint changes the power dynamic completely. Because the modern media machine runs on friction, a hot take needs fuel, a criticism needs a reaction, a debate needs two sides. When one side refuses to engage, the machine stalls. And that's exactly what's happening here. Instead of arguing narratives, he lets structure speak. Contracts, equity terms, sales surges, infrastructure strain, those aren't opinions, they're measurable outcomes. You can debate personality. You can debate style. You can't debate systems buckling under real demand. Silence backed by execution is louder than outrage backed by speculation. And here's the discipline behind it. Silence only works when you know your foundation is strong. If your structure is weak, silence looks like avoidance. If your leverage is thin, silence looks like fear. But when contracts are locked, when demand materializes instantly, when brands adjust instead of you adjusting, Silence reads as certainty. That's what unnerves people. An athlete who doesn't need controversy to stay relevant exposes how much of the industry depends on noise. When attention isn't chased, but activated strategically, the old playbook starts to look desperate. Instead of fighting narratives, he redirects attention back to receipts, back to execution, back to structural leverage. And the moment you realize that, something clicks. The game isn't being played at the same level anymore. While others argue about headlines, he's negotiating governance. While critics debate perception, he's securing participation. And once the results are locked in, commentary becomes background noise. But here, where it gets even bigger. Because once one athlete proves this works, the entire industry has to adjust. The real shift didn't happen on social media. It happened in boardrooms, quietly, behind closed doors. Once Shedeur proved this ownership-first model could work, contracts across the industry started to feel outdated the moment they were opened. Executives who had relied on flat fee structures for decades suddenly faced uncomfortable questions. Why are we still offering capped upside? Why do we control equity when the audience belongs to the athlete? Why are we paying for exposure instead of partnering for growth? And those questions don't disappear once asked. Reports suggest that internally, brands began revisiting how they structure athlete deals, not just for him, but across the board. Because once profit participation is granted successfully to one player, denying it to the next becomes harder to justify. That's how precedent works. It doesn't shout. It spreads. Front offices felt it too. Teams that once evaluated athletes strictly through on-field production had to acknowledge something new. Off-field architecture now feeds back into leverage, brand value, and long-term positioning. The miscalculation wasn't about talent. It was about vision. In a league still adjusting to players as full-spectrum operators, not just performers but economic engines, this compressed the margin for error. Because if this model works early in a career, it becomes standard sooner than anyone expected. And that's what rattles institutions. This wasn't a 15-year veteran bending the system after decades of dominance. This was someone operating decisively from the beginning. No waiting period, no permission phase. That timeline forces adaptation. Agents have already adjusted their pitch language. Exposure and prestige don't sound as compelling when equity and governance are possible. Younger athletes are reportedly asking sharper questions now. Not how much is the deal, but how is this structured? That's a seismic shift. Because once athletes realize they can negotiate not just presence but power, the talent economy tightens. Flat fees feel small. Short-term campaigns feel temporary. Ownership feels inevitable. And here's the part that matters most. This shift didn't rely on controversy. It didn't rely on outrage. It didn't rely on one viral moment. It relied on execution. Systems responded or failed in real time. Contracts were rewritten quietly. Internal playbooks were updated without public announcements. No headlines needed. And once a blueprint is visible and measurable, it stops being a trend. It becomes the new expectation. Which leads to the final question no one in the industry can avoid anymore. If this is the future, who adapts fast enough to survive it? Step back from the headlines for a second. This was never about one fashion alignment. It was never about one rejected offer. It was never about flexing leverage for attention. It was about a structural reset that most of the industry hoped would take another decade. For years, athletes had visibility. Then they gained influence. Social media gave them reach. But ownership, governance, control over how value circulates after attention is generated. That was supposed to move slowly, in isolated cases, easy to contain. This moment proved the opposite. Demand materialized instantly. Systems strained publicly. Contracts shifted quietly. You can't undo that. Because once a blueprint works in real time, it stops being theory. It becomes precedent. And precedent spreads faster than hype ever could. The old model was simple. Brands pay, athletes perform, upside flows one direction. That logic survived because it was comfortable, not because it was optimal. Now the conversation sounds different. Athletes aren't asking for better campaigns. They're asking for equity. They aren't negotiating for visibility. They are negotiating for participation. They aren't satisfied being faces. They expect to help design the framework. And brands that still believe exposure is enough will eventually face a harder reality. The audience doesn't live with the logo. It lives with the individual. This isn't rebellion for clicks. It isn't disruption for drama. It's alignment with how culture actually moves now. Power doesn't trickle down from institutions anymore. It builds outward from individuals who own trust and know how to activate it. That's the lasting takeaway. This wasn't a celebrity moment. It was proof of a shift already underway. The era of passive athlete marketing is ending. What replaces it is more permanent. A system where those who generate value help decide where it goes. And now that the framework exists, the industry doesn't get to ask if it's coming. It only gets to decide how quickly it adapts.